Galatians chapter 2. We'll finish up chapter 2 and move into 3 today. First two chapters, of course, Paul spends defending his apostleship, authority in the gospel which he preached. And the last thing he does is, of course, there was this question about his consistency in teaching and life and practice. And the last thing he does, of course, is to show that while he was consistent in his practice, the hero, when I say hero, I don't mean he put himself out there as a hero, but one of those that the Judaizing teachers look to as, or at least that they like to throw up to the Galatians, was Peter. And Paul points out that Peter was very consistent, at least on this one occasion, with what he knew to be the truth and what he practiced. And so when he comes to Antioch and does what he does, acts hypocritically, and as we talked about before, because of his influence, he draws others after him, Barnabas included. You know, Paul said, I had to stand him to the face. I had to do so publicly because his activities were public, and it could have really caused a rift there in the church between Jew and Gentile if Peter's conduct left the impression that the Gentiles also had to obey the law of Moses, or at least some aspects of it. We don't have too many false teachers in the church today teaching that we need to be following the old law. Although there are religious groups that do, or at least attempt to follow some aspects of it. Pick and choose, that's right. You think about Sabbatarians, various religious groups that want to keep Sabbath day. You have those. And then, of course, if you get into a discussion, at least you used to, I don't know if people even care anymore about it, or a lot of people don't. Some still do, but a lot of people don't care so much about authority anymore, but it used to be when you get in discussion with your denominational friends about authority for instrumental music, for instance, then the only place they could go to for their authority was obviously the old law. It's not found in the New Testament. So you do have some of that, but by and large, we don't have this issue. This was unique because of this transition period. The Jews had been under the law of Moses for 1,500 years, and it was not easy. I mean, with something like that, it's ingrained in your culture. It's not that easy to give it up. And in fact, many of them really didn't. They didn't give up all of it. They were allowed, frankly, to continue to practice some of those elements as long as it didn't interfere with their true practice of Christianity. Paul, even on occasion, remember when he came to Jerusalem, he was asked to go into the temple and fulfill a cleansing ritual for these fellows that had been under a vow and so forth. And this was all under the Mosaic dispensation. I mean, it wasn't necessary, but for conscience sake, some of them continued to do that. Peter, as we noticed before, as Paul said, he'd obviously given up a lot of, at least some of those elements of the law of Moses. He wasn't keeping it like he used to because he knew it had been done away. But we were in this period, and so you had this issue. Do the Gentiles have to keep it? No, they never had to, and so we're not going to make them now. And when I say they never had to, there is that argument between whether Moses and others in the book of Romans, what law they were under, whether they were amenable to it or had to proselytize or whatever. But not getting into that, bottom line is they didn't have to keep it, and so Peter knew that. He was to be condemned, it says, a strong word there. And so Paul takes the matter up with him. We spent a lot of time last week talking about justification. What does that mean, and how are we justified? How are we declared righteous? It is a legal term. How can a man be declared righteous and God still be just? That's a great question. And it's answered in Romans chapter 3, as we saw. how can God be just and the justifier of those who have sinned against His holy and eternal nature? That can only be done by punishing our sins, our guilt, taking it to the cross in the person of Christ. And so, because we identify with His life and death in our obedience to the gospel, then He can do that. But, as he says there, it's not by works of the law, because as we noticed last week, and this is important as we continue the discussion, law can only do what? Law can only judge. It can only condemn a man. Even law today. And so the point I guess I'm trying to make is, even though we don't have this particular issue, there certainly is the issue of we're not going to be saved under any system of strict law keeping. And much of the denominational world went into Calvinism and embraced Calvinism, and that is the idea that really there's nothing you can do as far as your salvation is concerned. For the same reason that Luther wrote his 95 Theses and tacked them on the door of the church in Wittenberg, where it was, because it was a reaction to who and to what? What was it a reaction to? Roman Catholicism, which it was in many ways a works-based system of salvation. And in fact, you can not only work your way here to heaven, but you could even work your way after you died, right? If you went into purgatory, and you were there long enough, or somebody was, and of course what Luther got upset about is somebody gave enough money, to buy you out, then, you could still make it. So a works-based salvation, which there is no such thing as a law or a works-based system that will save us. And so, as we mentioned last week, even under our laws today, if I go to court and I've broken a law, I don't want the law thrown at me. I want mercy, right? And so, that's the deal. And so, but God is able to justify us, treat us legally as if we'd not sinned. We sometimes say justified, never sinned. Declare us, reckon us as righteous because of what Christ did. So we got to verse 17, but let's read there to the end of the chapter, Galatians chapter 2. But if while we seek to be justified by Christ, we ourselves are also found sinners, is Christ therefore a minister of sin? Certainly not. For if I build again those things which I destroyed, I make myself a transgressor. For I through the law died to the law that I might live to God. I've been crucified with Christ. So no longer I live, but Christ lives in me. And the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. Some translations say gave himself up for me. I do not set aside the grace of God, for if righteousness comes through the law, then Christ died in vain, or he died for no reason, one translation says. Another says he died needlessly. Well, right. So here I am. If the gospel that Paul preached was sufficient to justify the Gentiles without adding on the law of Moses, but now you're going to come along and say, no, they got to have it. In other words, these Gentiles have to accept some elements of the law of Moses to be saved. Well, it sounds to me sounds like he didn't do such a good thing at all, right? Why did he die? I mean, if he died to do away with a law that we have to have or need, what does that say about him? Is Christ a minister of sin for doing what he did? I mean, if you've got to have it, well, he didn't do us any favors by dying to get rid of it. And what does this mean? He's building up the things which he destroyed. And Paul is talking, this reminds me again of 1 Corinthians 4:6. I think, this is just my opinion. There is that discussion of whether this includes the things that Paul said on that occasion or whether he's just explaining. But if you'll notice at the beginning of chapter 3, he actually directly addresses the Galatians. But in this discussion in 1 Corinthians, over division. And you remember in chapter 1, some were saying what? I'm of this person, I'm of Apollos, I'm of Cephas. Well, you go into chapter 4, verse 6, Paul in his discussion says, look, these things, brethren, I have figuratively transferred to myself and Apollos. He said, look, I'm just using I'm using our names as a stand-in when I make these arguments. I'm not saying that, that this is what's going on from us personally. And that's kind of the way I see this here. He says, but so Paul identifies here himself with Peter and says, look, Peter, if we seek to be justified by Christ, he's kind of, I think in a way, kind of trying to take the pressure off of him a little bit. If we're found sinners, is Christ therefore a minister of sin? For if then he transfers the whole thing to himself. He says, look, take me for an example. If I build again those things which I destroyed, those ceremonial laws of Judaism, and I imply that I've got to start doing those again, then I've made myself a what? A transgressor. If I start doing that, if I build again the things which I've taken away and I destroy and I start bringing them back in again, then I make myself a transgressor. Right? And that includes all those ceremonial rites and stuff of Judaism. I'm increasing my sin by doing this. And notice he says, for I through the law died to the law that I might live to God. Well, what law is he talking about? The law. Well, we know he's talking about the law of Moses, right? So, I through the law died to the law. If I truly understand, and that's the thing about the Jewish nation, who failed to see Christ, their Messiah, when he came, and even their need for him. If I, through the law, finally understood, came to understand that, law-keeping will not justify them. And that's what it should have taught them. I mean, the law, over 1,500 years of the law, should have taught the Jewish people that law-keeping will not save them. I can't keep it perfectly, and that's the only way to be saved by law, is not to violate it. If I had understood that, and if it teaches me that I should lay aside all expectations of being saved by a law system, well then, I got the point. And so, that's what it was teaching me. And as painful as that is, I guess, for the Jews, I mean, they were pretty proud, right? I mean, were they not pretty proud that they were the chosen ones that God had decided to give this law to? And in fact, in Romans, after Paul the Holy Spirit through Paul kind of punches them in the face, he then comes back and says, what advantage then did you have? You're saying it's not such a good thing. Well, what advantage did they have? Well, they had the oracles of God. And they had a relationship with God that other nations didn't have. They did have some advantages. But what it should have taught them, as painful as it might be, that if I finally understood from 1,500 years of that law-keeping wouldn't have saved me, that should have prepared me for what? As a people. For a better system, as the Hebrews calls it. Hebrews uses that word better. That's the key word of the book. Everything about the gospel system and what Christ brought is better, and that's what all of that law-keeping should have taught me. Is that I should have been ready to turn my back on that and accept the better when it arrived. And therefore, then I could replace my dead life of sin with a life of active service. I, through the law, died to the law that I might live to God. And then he gives this nice, in verse 20, this nice summary of the Christian life, you might say. We sing it quite a bit. I have been crucified with Christ. It's no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. And the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. Well, I have been crucified with Christ kind of reminds you of Romans chapter 6. And keep in mind, Galatians and Romans they're written about the same topics. It's just that Romans is a longer and more extensive and frankly more deep theological discussion of the same issues. You go over to Romans 6, he talks about being baptized into his death. Now look at verse 5. For if we've been united together in the likeness of his death, certainly we also shall be in the likeness of his resurrection, knowing this, that our old man was crucified with him, that the body of sin might be done away with, that we should no longer be slaves of sin. For he who has died has been freed from sin. We'll be talking a lot more about freedom in Galatians. But we've been crucified with him. What does that mean? I've been crucified with Christ. Yeah, I've put something to death. I've put that old man of sin to death. Not only have I put the old man of sin to death, but it also means if I've died to myself, right? Jesus said on one occasion, take up your cross, daily, and follow me. If I've died to myself, then that means there's a lot of things that no longer appeal to me. Right? Life is different. Yep.
Where do you see James in all of this, in this situation here, in Acts chapter 1, where he seems to be pushing Paul toward doing things Paul wouldn't have done on his own?
Are you talking about in Acts when he asked Paul to go in with those guys? Yeah. That's a tough question, and I know there's people come down on different sides. Some believe that, I think, and if I'm not mistaken, Brother Mosier even believes that Paul sinned on that occasion. I think he goes so far as to teach that he shouldn't have done what he did, and that James shouldn't have pushed him to that. There are others that seem to think that maybe James had more to do with these Judaizing teachers in Galatians than we want to believe. But I'm not, it's hard to say. Again, most commentators, I think, are going to say, look, yes, James was a Jew, obviously. He was an elder in the Jerusalem church. Judaism was a big deal to him. But certainly these guys in Galatia could have just come in throwing names around, because they knew. Yeah, we're of the party of James, and we're of the party of Peter. Well, we know Peter knew better. And I don't think, and actually Peter was not, Peter himself didn't come into Antioch and start telling these Gentiles they had to accept the law of Moses. Peter came to Antioch and was eating with the Gentiles and behaving just like he knew the truth to be. It was when he was scared of those that came from James from Jerusalem. Now the question is, what role did James have in that? Why should he be scared? I don't know. But I do know this. I find it hard to believe that if James were a bad guy, I find it hard to believe that the Lord or the Holy Spirit would have used him for book of the New Testament, which he did. And certainly Jesus' earthly siblings were tough on him before he died. But obviously the resurrection of Christ changed them significantly. And it changed James and Jude. And they both were writers of the New Testament. So I would be a little reluctant to blame this all on James. Now, could he have maybe had an attitude or such on occasions, or maybe he miscommunicated or people misunderstood his stance? I don't know. That's possible. We do that. But it's hard to know for sure. So we're no longer living to self when we're crucified. And of course, with crucifixion, we know that's a painful form of execution, right? And isn't that the whole purpose of crucifying people? I mean, we talk about torture. Waterboarding is nothing compared to crucifixion.
The Romans would not allow Roman citizens to be.
Absolutely. If the Romans would not allow their own citizens to be crucified, then that kind of tells you the excruciating manner of the death. So when I crucify myself, or when I'm crucified with Christ, and I put to death that old man, I'm going to have to give up some things maybe I used to do. Now, maybe not if you grew up in a Christian family, you don't. But if you come from the world, you're going to have to give up some things that you used to do, ways you used to live, ways you used to behave. Can that be painful? Yeah. It can be painful. Be painful too, because sometimes, as you know, we've had members here, we've had people come through school, we've had our own members who obeyed the gospel. Maybe they were the only one in their family from a very strong denominational background, and their families did what? Yeah, pretty much cut them off. That can be painful. Yeah, we have a student right now in that situation. So it can be painful. And of course, crucifixion is a slow way to die, right? But Jesus actually died pretty quick, as crucifixions go. I mean, those people could be left there for a few days. Do what? Yeah, and of course, they all got that, but there was a lot more to his pain, though, than just physical. I mean, we can't comprehend. Jesus' spirit was eternal. And I don't mean eternal in the sense like ours, once we're born, we'll never die. I mean, he was God. He's always been. So whatever he suffered emotionally and mentally, he suffered to that degree. It's something we can't comprehend. My wife told me to silence my phone. But the point is, crucifixion could be a slow death. Well, when I'm crucified with Christ and I'm trying to put to death the old man, sometimes we can become impatient because that can be kind of slow sometimes, I guess. You know, depending on what the habits are we're trying to break, it can be difficult. So it's no longer me that's living. It's no longer me that's on the throne of my life. That's where I've placed Christ. Because what? He lives in me. It's no longer I, but Christ lives in me. And it's interesting when I read Acts chapter 1, the very beginning, Luke says that Jesus, I'm going to tell you, Theophilus, what Jesus did. What did he do? He began both to what? Do and teach. The life of Jesus was a life of doing and teaching. So, if I'm going to be crucified with Christ, I'm putting to death the old man, and now Christ lives in me. So what should my life be about? Doing and teaching. It's a life of active service. It's not a life of sitting on the sidelines. As the Hebrews writer said, it's a long-distance race. And so we're to be active servants of the Lord. And then he says, I do not set aside the grace of God. I'm not going to, I think the ESV and the New American Standard say nullify. That's what that Greek word means. I'm not going to set aside. I'm not going to nullify the grace of God. For if righteousness comes through the law, then Christ died needlessly in vain. Well, it doesn't come through the law. And he didn't shed his blood for nothing. And our salvation is not dependent upon living a perfectly sinless life, and for which we should all be thankful every day we get up. Because Romans 3:23 says what? All have sinned, come short of the glory of God. So, That's the beauty of justification through the gospel of Christ. Peter's activities indicated that there was something, for some reason, his example would have led others to say, oh, let's go back to that in some form or fashion, or amalgamate it with the gospel. And Paul says no. So, that ends our first section of the book, chapters 1 and 2, Paul's defense, which he had to do because that's the way the Judaizing teachers had wormed their way into the Galatian churches, was to first attack Paul's credibility, because he's the one that established it. Attacked his manner of life, his message, and so forth, in order to win these people over. Well, now he moves on to what we sometimes call, I guess, chapters 3 and 4 can be called the doctrinal section, if you will. And usually the chapters 5 and 6 is called the practical section. Well, it's all practical, but you know what we mean. So how does he start out? Pretty strong language, right? Let's read verses 1 through 5, this past experience of the Galatians. O foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you that you should not obey the truth? Before whose eyes Jesus Christ was clearly portrayed among you as crucified. This only I want to learn from you. Did you receive the Spirit by the works of the law, or by the hearing of faith, the faith? Are you so foolish, having begun in the Spirit, are you now being made perfect by the flesh? Now this is one of those times where the flesh means what? Law. Many times in both Romans and Galatians, because that's the context of both of these books. Keep in mind, the law of Moses, the old law, is being contrasted with the gospel system. So sometimes he'll contrast the word spirit and flesh. So that's why it's very important when you translate the word for flesh in the book of Romans, that you translate it flesh, because you miss the point if you do like one modern version and you translate it sinful nature. Well, you've missed the whole point. In addition to putting false doctrine in there. But it is flesh. That's the way it should be translated. So, and because that's the contrast we're looking at. Have you suffered so many things in vain, if indeed it was in vain? Therefore, he who supplies the Spirit to you and works miracles among you, does he do it by the works of the law, or by the hearing of faith? Gospel. Well, it's interesting, foolish. This Greek word for foolish, grab my notes from Earl's. Some translators or some scholars have translated it thoughtless. Moffat, Goodspeed, and Williams translate it senseless. Alpha in the Greek just negates the meaning of whatever word it's attached to, which is what we have here. So the noun part of this word, A-N-O-E-T-O-S, means mind. So no mind, not mind. And so I guess the fundamental meaning might be not thinking, but that's probably too weak to translate it that way. Because as one translator said, Vincent notes that this word is used by Paul mainly with an ethical reference as the faculty of moral judgment. So what he's saying is here, it's not just a matter of they're just not thinking, they're just thoughtless. The point is that it's a folly which is the outgrowth of a moral defect. And so if you just say senseless or thoughtless, you're only stressing the mental part of it. You're leaving out the moral part. So, and the bottom line is, what Dr. Earl comes around to say is, look, foolish is a pretty good translation. Foolish. Well, I don't know if it'd be too strong. In some translations, modern translations probably use the word stupid. I think the point he's making is, does stupid only convey the idea of a lack of mental thought and leave out the moral aspect of it? Because you go back to Psalms, and the psalmist said, who has said in his heart, there is no God? The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. When you call somebody a fool then, with these Greek and Hebrew words, it's not just that they're absent-minded or they're not thinking or they're senseless or stupid. It's the fact that the reason they're thinking that way is from some deeper moral defect. The fool who says in his heart there is no God is not thinking, but he's not thinking and it's his fault, I guess is the way I would say it. I mean, he has no excuse for not thinking clearly. Yeah. And so when he says, "Oh, foolish Galatians," he's saying, yeah, you're not thinking, but look, you're culpable in this. You are responsible. It's your fault because you've been bewitched, charmed. This is an interesting word too. This Greek word, baskino, originally meant slander, speak ill of one. But then it came to have the meaning blight by the evil eye, fascinate, bewitch. So he's kind of like saying, well, who put the evil eye on you? Who cast a spell on you? Somebody says, well, Paul didn't believe in evil eyes and spells. No, he didn't. But you know who did? The people he was writing to, the pagans of that day. He didn't believe in magic, but look, think of when he went into those places and what did they do? What did they do in one place when they all were converted? What it said, they built a big bonfire and did what? Burned their books of magic and sorcery and all that. Those people believed in that stuff. And he says, look, you're acting like someone has put the evil eye on you. It's like a snake charmer. These guys have come in, these false teachers, and they've charmed you. They've bewitched you. And so they've turned you away from the truth. Yeah. Pull the wool over their eyes. But the point being, when he calls them foolish, is when he says they pulled the wool over your eyes. Sometimes, again, when we talk about people pulling the wool over our eyes, yeah, there are occasions where people can fool us. And it's not our fault, really. I mean, some devious people, they can just present themselves in such a way, and you find out later, well, they're not what they seem to be. But there are also times when we get fooled, and we actually allow ourselves to be fooled. In other words, we have some culpability in that. Wasn't it Gomer Pyle, that great philosopher, that said, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. Right. So, and that's what had happened to these people. And so, they, of course, were not drawn away by, he says that you should not obey the truth. Well, the truth didn't have anything to do with it. If they'd have been studying the truth, they wouldn't have been drawn away. They were looking at the people that were the actual teachers. That's where their focus was. And that's what happens to us today when our focus is on the teacher and not the doctrine. That's how people get drawn away today. Jesus said you don't judge a tree by its appearance, right? You judge it by its fruit. And so, false teachers, they can be sincere and they can be friendly and they can be congenial. And I've known of people that have, false teachers have done some good things for them. Maybe they've helped their family. Maybe they've helped somebody with an addiction or whatever. They're not bad. In that sense, they're not bad people. In that sense. I mean, they do some good things. They can be helpful. But that's when they're the most dangerous, because when you start looking at the person and not what he's teaching, then it becomes a Pied Piper situation. And Paul says, look, the truth was presented to you clearly, plainly, before whose eyes Jesus Christ was clearly portrayed. The King James says, evidently set forth. The ASB says, openly set forth. This is one Greek word, one word in the Greek, this phrase. It looks kind of like prographe. But Moffat renders it placard. What's a placard? It's a sign. The New King James says, clearly portrayed. The New American Standard, I think it's the New American Standard, maybe the SB too, says publicly portrayed. It's like somebody held up a big sign. Lightfoot says it is the common word to describe all public notices or proclamations. Yeah. Yeah, you know, the guy that walked down the sidewalk with the signs hanging on his neck. And so, right. And so that's how clear Paul says this was publicly portrayed. That is, Jesus Christ was among you as crucified. You were told the truth. But I like his argument here. And again, this gets back to your view. Really, to understand this passage, I think you have to somewhat have a clear view of the work of the Holy Spirit. This only I want to learn from you. Did you receive the Spirit, capital, by the works of the law? Or by the hearing of faith, or the faith? So question. And he goes on, and now, okay, what's the context? If you keep going, look at verse 5. Therefore, he who supplies the Spirit to you and works miracles. So, Paul says, when did you receive these various gifts, miraculous gifts? How did that come? Who supplied those? Absolutely. In this case, Paul's hands directly. But of course, directly actually through the Spirit, indirectly through Paul's hands. But the point is, did you get that? Did you get those abilities under the old law? Did that come with the law? Or did that come with the gospel system? Well, to ask the questions to answer. So this ought to settle the question right here. And again, which gets me back to the whole point is, what if Paul had said, well, when did you get that personal indwelling of the Spirit? So what are you talking about? You know, the one you can't feel, you don't know, but you have it. That wouldn't have made any sense to them at all. I mean, back then, the Spirit was demonstrated with power. See? But it accompanied gifts. And when they heard the gospel, that's when those gifts were distributed by Paul. So, if the gospel was so deficient, why did the Spirit, why did the power of the Spirit and these gifts from the Spirit, why did it come with the gospel, not with the law of Moses? Why wasn't it given before? Why did you have to mix the law with the gospel if you got all this stuff before that? And again, to ask is to answer. So again, he says, verse 3, are you so foolish? Ask him the same question. Are you so foolish? He's rebuking them. He says, everything points to my teaching as being authentic. Having begun in the Spirit, are you now being made perfect by the flesh? That is, the law of Moses. You're not going to be perfected under the law of Moses. That's what the flesh means there. And why do you suppose he uses that terminology? Why is the flesh here used as a synonym for the law of Moses? I mean, I think of a couple of things. But why use the flesh as a synonym for the law of Moses? I think that's number one. They were trusting in their own works. The book of Romans points that out. You know, Paul said they went about to what? Pursue their own righteousness rather than the righteousness of God, or that comes from God. And so, yes, they were trusting in their own works. But I'll also say this. There's no question that the law of Moses, when you compare that to the gospel system, one is clearly more spiritual in nature, and one is more earthbound. I mean, everything about the law of Moses was fleshly. I mean, all the lessons that were taught and learned were done through fleshly activities. actual animal sacrifices, what you ate or didn't eat, all of those kinds of things had to do with the flesh and the body. Whereas under the dispensation we live now, it's all about the spiritual. And that's not to say it doesn't affect the flesh or the way we live, but it goes from inside out, not outside in. God was teaching His people with physical observances about His nature and the nature of sin. And so I see a couple reasons there for using that synonym for the law of Moses. One, they were trusting in their own works, fleshly works and activities. But two, when you look at the two systems, one was clearly more physical and earthbound than the other. And one was much more spiritual. I mean, we're all priests, right? But to be a priest under that dispensation, you had to be born physically into the priestly family. But I'm born again spiritually into this family, which makes me a priest. Again, it's spiritual in nature.
That's the whole idea of them being supposedly a chosen nation. They were not going to surrender. They thought they had that special privilege in that part.
Yeah, and what they failed to understand is once they became Christians, they would still be a chosen nation, a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a people for God's own possession. Same language He used in the Old Testament, He uses in the New Testament. They would still be that. The problem they had, of course, was that everybody else could be that too. And they don't like that. Because God says, look, everybody can be. Even the poor eunuch, the dry, the withered up tree, the Old Testament calls him, who couldn't worship in the temple because of his physical imperfections. Is that Jeremiah, Isaiah? I don't remember which book it is. It says, even him, the physical eunuch, that has nothing to do with anything under the New Testament. No matter what your physical imperfections are, you can worship and be a priest in this new dispensation. You don't have those physical requirements. All right, we'll pick up there next week.